All right, on to climate change. There was a recent report by Oxfam, which has highlighted the disproportionate environmental impact of Mexico's wealthiest individuals, which they then extrapolated and put onto the global scenario. So the report, published in conjunction with the 2023 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Dubai, reveals that in 2019, the richest 1% in Mexico were responsible for more than 80% of the country's pollution. Oxfam proposes a radical solution, a 60% tax on the incomes of the richest 1%. So, what's your thoughts there?
Well, it's not a solution. It's just not. Sorry. So first of all, when you take a study in a country like Mexico and you extrapolate that and then say that it's the entire world, that's flawed logic to begin with. It's sort of like you're manipulating data to suit your needs, right? The next thing is when you say you're going to tax the rich 60%. So there's a couple things you got to consider there. First of all, that's never going to happen. Literally, there's no possibility of it happening because, first of all, they run the governments. Rich people run the government. We know this. They fund both sides. That's pretty straightforward. Second of all, there's no government apparatus in place that's going to allow them to take that kind of money from all these rich people. There's no way. They're the ones that sort of shaped policy, right? And if for some reason things start moving in that direction, what you're going to see is everyone's going to move their money further offshore. That's exactly what they're going to do. So it's a dead end. It's not really a solution. So here's what I actually think it is. I'll get into the climate stuff after, because right now I just think this is an attack on rich people. Instead of working through a solution, the government now, by taxing these people or suggesting to tax these people at 60%, you're just saying that it's the rich person's fault. That's all you're doing. You're just placing blame on someone else, and you're vilifying them. You're finding a villain, and you're saying, well, if they give us all of their money rather, we can solve this problem, which is unequivocally false. Giving the government money to fix a problem never works. Like you mentioned the other day, look at homelessness. I think, I may get this number wrong, but I think it's $300 million a year. It could be billion, but I think it's $300 million a year that goes into solving homelessness in California. And it's only getting worse, which means all they're doing is taking taxpayer dollars and putting it into the pockets of people that are doing an inefficient job. Said this the other day too, with the CMHC. They've had $15 billion in government funding over the last 7-8 years. They had one project in particular where they were supposed to build 687 homes. They built 12. Their efficiency was 2%. So giving these people money doesn't solve the problem. What you have is people that just want to take more money and more power away from people that have money and power. That's the way I'm seeing this study. I think it's fucking bullshit. Now, one of the other things that I would like to highlight is when they say the richest 1% of people are responsible for 80% of the pollution, when you say that, you got to ask yourselves, where's the majority of pollution coming from? The majority is coming from the commercial sector, energy, production, all this other stuff. Now, these rich people own these things. So obviously you can lump that under these people to be like, well, they own this stuff, therefore they're responsible for the pollution. However, that's kind of a false, it gives people this sort of this false sense of you can blame someone else for this because you and I are the ones that use them. Everybody uses them. You use them to heat your own homes. You use them to drive around, whether it's the car or the gasoline you're putting in your car. You know what I mean? Anywhere where you're seeing massive pollution, they are producing something that the rest of society uses so that they can survive. So we're all kind of playing the same game. These people are just the ones making money off of it. Because if you try to take all the things away that are producing the largest amount of pollution, like fossil fuels, what happens to society? You cut fossil fuels today, we all die. Sorry, it's how it's going to go. So for me, that's definitely a big part of the problem. With respect to an actual solution here, if they would put some sort of incentivize these wealthy people to invest in, for-profit carbon reduction programs, then what you might do is you might get people that are sort of, want to be the good guys. And I can appreciate that. I think a lot of them do. I think if you ask people, do you want to save the earth? 99.9% of people are going to go, yeah, I do. I want the earth to be around for my kids and future generations. Well, here's how you can do it. If you invest in these programs that do make money, that do neutralize or reduce carbon, and you produce this much, here's how you can get to a net zero individually. Well, now there's a real solution. Instead of doing something like that, they just implement these programs that are just meant to vilify one side versus the other over power and money, and it's kind of bullshit.
Talking about these bureaucracies' inefficiencies at solving these issues, especially one as massive as this, which we don't, you can boil it down to they want to control the weather, which is just the idea that first off, the government is even competent enough to do that is just wildly ridiculous. But then you have to think about the fact that these bureaucracies, whether it be homelessness, whether it be climate change, all of this stuff, the people in them, they do not bear the consequences of the problem itself, and they also don't bear the consequences if they fail to solve the problem. Meaning, let's take homelessness, for example. The homeless people aren't sleeping on these bureaucrats' front doors, so they don't actually have to deal with the problem. And then second, if they spend all of this money and take from taxpayers and such, and then fail to solve the problem, they yet again do not face the consequences for that problem. So I think it's a Sowell quote, but he said, "I can't think of a worse idea than putting people in charge of something that they don't bear the consequences of." It's just expecting a solution to come out of that is preposterous. But then you also look at how they want to solve this issue, which is, yes, take in this wealth and then subsidize certain areas, say EVs or green energy, all of this stuff. But then you look at what happens in practice was even earlier this year, was the American government announced a $7,000 subsidy, essentially tax credit, whatever, for buying an EV vehicle.
Right.
The very next day, all the manufacturers upped the prices of their EVs by $7,000. And you look at any single sector that the government heavily subsidizes, and they are all the most expensive, that have inflated the most over the last 50 years, are the exact industries which the government is heavily involved in. So the idea that, climate change will be solved by giving the government more money is mind-numbing to me.
Well, what would happen, actually, now that you mention it, is the rich people would just find ways to get all their money back. Like, hey, man, they outsmarted you the first time. They're going to do it again. Because the thing is, I think a lot of times, in most cases, I think if politicians could trade places with the richest people in the world and have success as entrepreneurs, that's what they would do. So, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that it's a dead-end solution to a problem that I'm not even sure is as bad as we think that it really is.
It's not. You look at, for instance, the apocalyptic narrative of climate change. Climate-related deaths or severe weather event deaths have dropped by 96% over the last 100 years. You look at things like, for instance,
that's so alarming.
you look at headlines over heat waves that happen in places. So, for instance, there was one this summer about the deadliest heat wave in India's history, which claimed 25,000 people. How they come up with that number, who knows? But then you can put that against the fact that same year, over 500,000 people in India died from extreme cold. So every year, no matter the country you take it, it's about 10 times more people die from extreme cold than extreme heat. And this idea I see being put out there where climate change, okay, I think the climate is changing, because I also don't think you can ever get it to stop changing.
Definitely not.
So really, we're now talking about a realistic, not stopping it, but what is a realistic rate that it can change at. And I don't think we're seeing anything, even their most alarming examples. I don't think you can say that, like, where are the consequences from these? Because as pointing out, like, the deaths from all of this stuff is just dramatically decreasing. And then also, we're getting better and better at adaptation. Like, even you look at things like, for instance, Holland. Like, Amsterdam should not exist. They carved that out of the ocean. Like, this idea that if the water levels rise by an inch, humanity is doomed. You're like, no, we've actually proven over the last couple centuries that we're incredibly capable of dealing with these issues as they arise. But I think handicapping ourselves and essentially weakening our ability to face those problems by terrible economic policies and such, that when those issues come around, we'll only be worse off to deal with them now.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think that one of the big problems you have is that politicians don't think 20, 30 years down the road, right? They think 4 years in front of them, and they think re-election. That's how they operate. So they look at everything as this urgent issue that needs to be solved today, it's just not really true. And one of the things humans do not do well is we don't solve long-term problems very well. If you look at the rise in temperature from the 1800s to now, it's marginal, especially considering you're like, oh, here's our death point. It's like, it's actually not accurate. And if you look through history, there is a cyclical, rather, There's a cyclical nature to there's ebbs and flows to how the earth is going to heat and cool. It's how it operates. And, people that I've listened to that are on the other side of this, kind of where you and I sort of sit, they just say this whole thing. They're like, there's no solid science to really prove that this is going where they say that it's going. It's just, there's just nothing there. And, you see these things like, Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth and how the water levels are going to rise 20 feet. And I'm like, you guys know most of the earth is water, right? Already. So tell me how that displacement math is going to work, especially considering a lot of the glaciers up in north and southern points of the world are already in water. You ever put ice in water? It's all, when the ice is there, the water level is high. When it completely melts, it only goes, if at all. The displacement math doesn't quite work for me. Maybe someone smarter than I am could point out where I'm going wrong there, but I just don't see these figures adding up at all. And it just feels like more fear porn than anything.
Well, and all of the forecasts for the terrible things that are going to happen, whether you talk about Al Gore or the UN throughout the last 50 years, we, humanity-wise, we have a short-term memory with the propaganda we've been fed.
Of course.
But if you go back and look, from the 1940s to the 1970s, the global temperature was actually decreasing, which to me, I'm like, okay, that was the fallout of World War II was the largest industrial boom ever.
Right.
More carbon emissions being put out than ever. In the next 30 years, the temperature went down. So now taking this single factor point, which is CO2, and putting everything on CO2 as far as warming the climate, it's like that doesn't add up for, like, how do you explain that 1940s to 70s period then? And then also, like, even the UN said that the UK would be a Siberian hellscape by 2020 back in like the 90s. They've been everything. Oil was going to run out in the 90s. There's a small think tank group which did some heavy lobbying back in the mid 1900s and later, which was the Club of Rome, and they were all about this environmental doom. And I think that you can actually trace pretty much all of these ideas back to this, which was, you look at it and their solution to everything was degrowth. We need to slow down, the human population, how much we're doing economically, all of this. They just were uncomfortable with that growth, and none of their predictions have come true. So that's...
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with everything you're saying. Yeah, it's one of those things that you're right, that people do not remember the bullshit that we've been fed over the years. And if you look back and you look into it, you're like, that's pretty alarming stuff. It's all basically horseshit. None of it really came true. And one of the big problems I guess I have with it, look, I'm all for treating the environment better, 100%. But I'm also for being pragmatic about the effects we're having on it at scale. But I think more importantly, you do have real short-term problems. This isn't one of them. Your real short-term problem is feeding people, is putting a roof over their head, is making sure that people can continue to survive. And we seem to be putting all of that in the back seat compared to this climate agenda. And that to me is quite alarming when you're willing to sacrifice people, the economy, everybody's well-being for something that, again, there's not enough meat on the bone in terms of their argument. And I'm just surprised that they're willing to sacrifice everyone. And then everyone agrees with them. Not everyone, but you know what I mean? A large portion of people jump on board and say that it's okay and want to keep doing it. And I don't know how you right the ship or how they've convinced so many people of this, but one way or another, I hope we start identifying, and I think we are a little bit, that, taking care of yourself today has got to be number one, or else you're not even going to survive to see what tomorrow looks like, or whenever the climate gets better and things are okay. So I think we just need to reorganize our priorities a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. You could on the environmentalism front, you could focus a lot more on things that you can see how successful you're being at, such as, say, limiting plastics in the ocean runoff, these garbage islands that you see in third world countries that essentially get all of our shit electronics shipped over to them and they just end up in a landfill. Things like East Palestine, where the chemical spill into the river, things like that, where you can actually measure as you go. But like, dude, the climate is a 30-year period, is what the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, defines climate as a 30-year period. And then also CO2, any emissions from CO2 last in the atmosphere for 60 years. So you're now measuring a 30-year period, and let's say we cut all emissions today, all emissions go out the window. You're not even going to be able to see the effect of that for 60 years because all of those emissions are already up there.
Right. Because it gets lumped in. It doesn't really, it's almost like you look at it in 60 different parts because 60 different years, even if you have a really effective year at scale, when you look at that average, it's a drop in a bucket. It makes literally no difference. So there's actually no way to identify, really your progress, especially because because every year you've got one coming in and one going out, right? As the chain moves, something falls off and something comes in. Unless we were tracking this with the same sort of standards 60 years ago, because that would be at least reasonable. You'd say, okay, every year it's going down a little bit, but if you don't know how bad this year was on year 60 or year 59 when that falls off, you really have no idea about the effect of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole thing.
Yeah.
The whole thing.
Everything is dependent on models.
Yeah, exactly. And then so for me, when I look at this, when I look at the study in this report, and their goal here is basically let's blame the rich and take all their money. I'm like, you guys are crazy. It's just weaponization of bullshit data to try to take more money from people, and it's never going to work.